Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us on this Friday at noon for just an hour. We're excited to have a group of discussants with her who've got, I think, among them a wealth of experience about our topic, which is co-authoring in the context of collaborations. What is our title? Collaborations and contributions. Okay, so that could cover a lot. We usually start with announcements, and I see Punya, you have joined us. You were not late after all. So I just jump in with some announcements and then we'll get to the topic. Sound good? So really want to thank those of you who joined last Friday's conversation, just an hour on creating more humane syllabi for our courses. And in particular, our invited discussants. So Leanna, I see you're here. Thanks so much. Amy Marcos and Lee Wolf, who participated by sharing a video. It prompted a really engaged discussion. And we'd actually like to continue the conversation. And I don't know, Clarin, could you maybe put the link in the chat? We put in the newsletter a link to a 3-question survey to assess interest in a more extended, we'll call it a workshop, on actually concretely addressing some of the issues that came up in terms of how our syllabi are or are not humane. So there's questions there about your interest and also what format, face-to-face or virtual. So we'd love to get as much, as many responses as possible. So a few other announcements. David Berlina, Margarita Pivara, I mangled her last name, and Norm Gibbs have published a piece in Washington Post's Answer Sheet blog about how school districts are wasting millions of dollars in testing, which was based on an article in our very own EPAA. So take a look at that.
Betty, if I can just jump in, if you haven't read that, it's a really short piece, but it is a wonderful piece, just showing like correlations between testing year after year and how highly they're correlated, that testing is really not adding the kind of information that we need. It's a really nice piece, and I strongly recommend reading it.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Punya. Yeah.
Can I ask a question? Clarin, I was just clicking on the link that you sent in the chat box, and it requires permission. I'm not sure if that has to do with my retirement, but.
I'll look into it, Hans. It shouldn't, but let me double check that.
How quickly you get excluded, Hans. How sad.
I'm extinct.
So just a note, the Next Education Workforce Summit just convened. I think they had quite a successful meeting, a lot of participants. And geez, we've got a lot of announcements. So most of you probably, if you don't know, recognize the name Kathy Hoffman, who was the former Arizona Superintendent of Public Instruction. We are fortunate that she is going to be joining Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College with the title of Executive Director of Innovation and Special Education Initiatives. And I think what that means is she's going to be trying to take leadership on a number of different fronts in terms of working on kind of revisioning special education and its place in schools, including working with the Next Education Workforce project and potentially getting together Learning Futures Collaborative around that topic. So I'm sure we'll be hearing more about that. And some of you have been involved. We just wrapped up today the annual campus visit for prospective PhD students. And we just want to give a shout out and congratulations to the staff and faculty who planned and participated in all the activities for this event. I know that's a really, really valuable opportunity, both for the PhD students and for faculty and potential faculty advisors. So a couple more events. Next Friday is the 9th annual Teachers College Doctoral Council Education research conference that will be held at least partly face-to-face at Farmer. That's on Friday, the 24th. And we're happy to announce that learning representatives, graduate students in particular from the Learning Futures Collaboratives, as well as Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College internal grant recipients will kick off the conference at 9 a.m. So we hope to see some of you there. And on the following Friday, we'll celebrate the 25th anniversary of Current Issues in Education, which is our doctoral student-run journal, refereed journal. It's an academic journal that is entirely run by our doctoral students with advisement from faculty. And I wanted to note in particular that the celebration will kick off with a panel of the founding editors, which includes faculty members or retired faculty members, Jean Glass and David Berliner, and current faculty member Gustavo Fishman. So I'm sure the whole celebration will be great, and in particular, it'll be great to hear from the panel. And if we could get these links in the chat too, just to recognize our colleagues at CIES and the U.S. Summit on Transformative Education, two major conferences. CIES is going on now. I'm not sure about the Summit on Transformative Education. Is that going on now or in the future? I don't have those dates.
I think it immediately follows CIES.
Immediately following. So lots of cool paper topics. I found it fun just to skim the schedule and see what our faculty and students are presenting on. And don't forget to share your own work in our scholarship roundup survey. Again, the link is in the newsletter and we can post it in chat. So we love, I say we, Punya and I know the rest of the leadership love to keep on top of what everyone is doing. So that's a lot. I'm going to take a breath. Punya, do you want to introduce our topic and our panelists for today?
All right. 3 years in, still forget to unmute. That's, yeah. All right. So thank you all for joining us today. We're talking today about sort of co-authoring. A lot of the work that we do, especially at ASU, and our emphasis on interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary work requires us to work with, co-author pieces with people within the college, with graduate students, with colleagues across the country or the world. So there are some, it can be tricky, it can be complicated sometimes. Issues of authorship can be very potent at times. So what we wanted to do was get a group of people together who have sort of extended experience in doing this. So that sustaining productive collaborations takes time and effort. Navigating different dimensions of collaboration can be tricky, different priorities, expectations, and commitments. So without going on for too long, let me just quickly introduce our discussants today. So Hans van der Mars, so thank you for joining us and continuing to fail at retirement. We are very glad that you are here with us. Andrea Weinberg, Assistant Professor, Lauren Harris, Associate Professor, and Amber Benedict, Assistant Professor. So maybe I'm going to start with Hans, with you. Can you tell us some different co-authoring experiences you've had with, and it could be anybody, grad students, teachers, postdocs, and other faculty, and then we'll sort of bounce from there.
Yeah, so, well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. I'm honestly not sure why I was considered a viable client.
Hans, we are losing your audio a little bit.
Now?
Yes.
Is this better?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Okay, good. So sorry. So yeah, I've had countless experiences of working with other authors, including graduate students, teachers in schools, as well as colleagues in my field. One of the things that with the pressures of needing to
crank out multiple papers a year, it's easy to lose sight of the question, like, why is this paper important and why are we writing on this topic? And I think that is something to consider. One thing that I have found helpful is to, if you're being introduced to a person who you've not worked with before, which is a possibility because it's all about collaboration these days and team-based publishing, read the work of the potential co-author or the potential collaborators, and not just for the substance of what the message is that's conveyed in the paper, be it professional or research, but look at the quality of writing. That will determine how easy it will be for you or how difficult it is for your team to co-write a paper or a chapter, what have you. Make sure that you're on the same page philosophically. That would be one suggestion I have. And that I found that to be, make life much easier if you're on the same page to philosophically to write about a topic. So now this may come, maybe that's being retired. My wife now thinks I'm a curmudgeon, but be sure that you discriminate between whether the co-author is genuinely interested in writing on the paper or the topic, or is trying to write your coattails. This may be more for more senior authors. And if the goal is for that person to get another publication, that may not be the best partner. And the thing is, once you've gone in to see with the co-author, then beware of superficial reviews. Like if I were to write with Elizabeth, and I'm just using Elizabeth as the easy target because she's first in line on my screen. If she and I are supposed to write a paper together and I only do a superficial review of something that she's drafted, like an initial draft, that's usually a good sign that there are going to be problems ahead, because how invested am I in the paper that we're supposed to write together? So look for thorough and constructive reviews. And I'll have a couple of more points about that later. Let's see. Graduate students usually need much more help. Writing is a skill that needs to be developed, and it's like learning to play tennis or becoming good at art, painting. If you want to get good at writing, you need to write and get good quality feedback. And so that will be something that's terribly important with especially graduate students, because generally they need more hand-holding. And just because they're doctoral students doesn't mean that they're established writers. So I'll stop there for now. I may have some other things later, but
thank you, Hans, and I do appreciate thank you, Hans, and I do appreciate this emphasis on sort of the art of writing, because very often it is, sometimes we tend to think of it more mechanically, while actually there is an art and a craft to writing, even academic prose, strange though it may seem. So I appreciate you're highlighting that. Andrea, why don't you introduce yourself, and not that everybody knows you here, but still, and then tell us a little bit about your experiences.
Sure. Thank you. I'm Andrea Weinberg. This is my 6th year here at ASU as I'm an assistant professor. And I had some experience as clinical faculty at another institution before this. And I think that really contributes to how I think about collaboration as well. So some of the co-authoring experiences I've had is with mentors and senior colleagues, and with near peer colleagues, with postdocs and doctoral students here at ASU and also at other institutions. I've also collaborated with K-12 teachers and master students and undergraduate students. And within each one of those, I think it's important to think about like the fact that all aspects of collaboration need to be considered in terms of like roles and positions. So thinking about collaborating with senior colleagues, for example, I might realize that there's things that they have moved through several times, and they might have like processes for going through things that is helpful for me to pay close attention to and learn. And then when I'm serving as more of a mentor, thinking about how to kind of make my thinking and moves and decisions more visible. So that's just really briefly some insight into like the different co-authoring experiences I've had and how I think about those a little bit differently based on who the collaborators are.
Thank you. Lauren?
Hi, everyone. I'm looking at the people on this call and thinking, well, all the people on this call do so much collaboration. So I'm Lauren Harris. I'm an associate professor. My field is history and social studies education and teacher education. And I have an appointment both in Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College and in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies. So I now realize that every single thing I do is collaborative, that I really don't want to do much that isn't. Every collaboration that I have, I think, drives me forward and keeps me going. And I don't know when my last sole authored presentation or article or anything like that was. So I really enjoy collaboration. I look for it. I also I've collaborated with people I've never met in person. So I'm looking at Leanna on this call. Leanna and I have collaborated on several things, and one a bunch with a former doc student at ASU who I never met when she was here, and because of COVID, she's at another university, and we've done I don't know how many different things, and we've never met in person. So Zoom can be really good for that. Electronic things like Google Drive can be really helpful for these kind of collaborations. I think about some of my most fruitful collaborations that are a little bit different, and one would be collaborating with people in the School of Shippers, where my work is really education research, so that's the kind of work I do. But I teamed up with some people in that school, a historian and then a scholar of religious studies, and we did a project on comparing teaching comparative genocide, and with 2 doctoral students. And that was a really interesting collaboration, just because they were coming from very different fields. And we, in this project, which had lots of different aspects to it. So some of it was getting some funding to do this workshop presentation type thing. Some of it was publishing. And I think that navigation and negotiation on sort of who's taking the lead at what time, and then coming from 3 different disciplines as well, I think was really interesting. And one of the things that I think about with collaborations, and it's usually actually with more than one person on a project as well, but sometimes just one other person. But thinking about, I think what Andrea was saying, like, who are the different people? What roles are they in? And what role are you going to take? So is this sort of coming in where 3 people, for example, are sort of all coming from the same place, peers or near peers? I like that phrase Andrea used. And in that case, are you splitting up? Someone's going to take the lead on this piece of it. Someone's taking the lead on this. That leads to a publication with one person as first author here. I'm thinking of the collaboration with Leanna and Catherine Shelton I was just talking about, where maybe we published so far 4 or 5 pieces, I can't remember. And each one of us took the lead on one of them and sort of split up author orders. So I saw that as a very sort of equal collaboration with the 3 of us. But then there's other ones where, you might have doctoral students, and I've worked in several collaborative experiences where I'm working with someone from another institution who's a peer, and we each have doctoral students we're working with. So then, and I'm involved in one of these right now. So then we have these Zoom meetings with, 3 doctoral students and then the 2 of us. And those are different because the doctoral students are learning, we're mentoring them. And, it's sort of negotiating how that works and what kind of work the doctoral students are doing and that sort of thing. And of course, as was mentioned at the top, author order is always something to think about. I just wanted to share a link. At one point, I published in Teaching and Teacher Education, and they, when you submit, they have you fill something out that basically writes up author credit, kind of an author credit statement for each of the authors involved. And I kind of liked how they have these categories and then they define what those are. And that for us as a research team, that particular group I was working with at the time, that was helpful for us in sort of, and that was another group where we had multiple doctoral students and people from different institutions. So I think having those conversations, at early is important, and sort of thinking about, okay, where, what roles are people in? Are there times where people are going to take the lead on different parts of this? And how is that going to work? So that's, I feel like a lot of the interesting discussions that can happen with these collaborations, including with people that, you've never worked with and barely know. And I've done those too, just sort of like, oh, do you want to collaborate? Okay, let's see how this works. But I think those conversations are good, and to have something to start with, some kind of guidelines or something, can be helpful.
Thank you, Leanna. And I'm going to come back in a follow-up question to
Lauren. You called me Leanna.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Sorry, apologies, Lauren. Thank you. I want to come back at some point to the authorship conversation, because that can get tricky. Knowing how much weight, who has pulled how much weight in these kinds of matters can get complicated. So and that can also get messy, because there are humans and relationships and then emotions get involved in that. But before that, Amber, on to you. Tell us about your experiences with collaboration.
Thank you, Punya. Thank you, Claren and Betty, for welcoming me and including me today. My name is Amber Benedict. I'm an assistant professor in Division I in the special education program. And collaboration is a central part of my work. So it's a part of my research, actually. I study the ways that we prepare general and special educators to work together in inclusive environments. And then I feel like the things that we learn within our scholarship kind of, sneak its way into our practices in how we write and work around this work in preparing teachers, supporting teachers in their work, and sharing what we're learning. And so one of the things that came to my mind while I was learning from Hans, you and Andrea, and then also Lauren, was the different types of projects that are collaborative in authorship, and that it's not always just a peer review paper. And so one of the things that we do within our collaborative teams is we think about the project and who's involved in all of the different aspects that people can be engaged in, from the beginning, the data collection, the literature review, but then also the dissemination plan for involvement in the presentations, involvement in the publications and policy briefs and webinars that might come from those things. And so it's really sometimes it's narrow and it's around one paper, but then oftentimes it becomes this spider web of activity, and it's building in the team in ways that they're interested and available to see those ideas from a vision into fruition. One of the practices on our teams that we really, I think, take to heart is building the team that we want to be a part of. And so, like Hans shared, doctoral students are a valuable part of our community. And you'll see if you look at my CV, it's just peppered with little stars in presentations, in grant writing, and then also in our publications. And that's because I really value folding in our doctoral scholars into every aspect of our work. And it's in an authentic and meaningful way, so that they are not just developing their confidence, but also their skill and ability to be critical thinkers in all of these different capacities. And so it's thinking about, sometimes it's tricky, and it's an investment of your time. And everyone on this call is so very busy because our students are needing increased support. But it's an investment in the future team that you hope to have as well. And so that time that you invest in supporting junior colleagues and also our doctoral scholars and building their repertoire for these activities will pay off in the end with a really strong, robust team. And so those were just kind of some of the thoughts that I was having while we were talking.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to put this question out there. So I know this, like when I'm working on a collaboration with people, I always overvalue my contribution to the project. That is just I think that I have put in a lot of work on it. And it's been a process for me to learn to recognize that actually I haven't contributed as much as I thought. And I guess that everybody's sort of thinking the same way, which is what makes these conversations about author order and all that sort of fraught, right? So I'm just curious to hear from you. How have you sort of managed to navigate that? Because a lot of our careers depend on first authorship and, blah, blah, blah. At the same time, you're trying to support your graduate students so that they have publications that they can go out in the world and, get into the job market. There are, of course, and Hans talked about, like, if you're a senior scholar, you might have people who want to possibly ride your coattails. So I'm just curious to, if you have any stories or examples of, like the one that I shared from myself was a learning for me, that I am overvaluing my contribution to this in many ways sometimes, and that I need to sort of understand the bigger picture here. And that was a process for me to get there. So I'm just curious to hear from the panelists and actually anybody on the Zoom call here, with a lot of expertise in this group right here. So anybody step in, and how do you sort of try to figure out what is fair? Because I think at the end of the day, that is what we're all trying to get at. Anybody, please step in.
Actually, if I can dovetail on a point that Punya made about, we're expected to have first author papers. I was in higher education for 39 years, and early on, when I started back in the early 80s, the cultural norm was that you needed to establish yourself by being able to publish on your own, and have first author paper, and that's especially was important in your probationary period. I have never ever received any notice of concern from a personnel committee at Arizona State, in my first stint at Oregon State, and then more recently in my second stint here at ASU, that I didn't have enough first author papers. I think after a while, I don't think that matters anymore. I think the committee just wants to see a quantity of publications per year. So I'm going to take a slightly different perspective on what Punya had. So when it comes to collaborating and what I would call the ethics of authorship, I just finished drafting a paper. It's for a professional journal. It's being reviewed by the CDC and by a large alliance, a national alliance, before we can submit it to a journal. But we have a team of about 8-9 authors, and one of the authors has not. It's been crickets from her. She has not responded to any request to provide feedback on the drafts, the earlier drafts, and so ethically, I have an issue with that. For which we're writing the paper has said no, all the committee members, because this is a committee that's part of a national physical activity plan. The leader said no, all the committee members need to be on the paper, and so I have to let that go. But ethically, I have an issue with that because she didn't do squat basically, and so when I was on the university tenure and promotion committee for 3 years. Has anybody on this group who's at this meeting, have you served on that committee? Okay. So typically graduate students who graduate with with their dissertation completed. Usually it's 2 to 3 papers that were drafted within the dissertation, and obviously they get sent out for publication. And the ethics are such that the grad student goes first, and that the advisor and perhaps 1 or 2 more committee members go second, third, fourth. And but after that, I think you want to be careful that you get the grad student or former grad student to fly on his or her own, meaning that they find other collaborative partners, because the University Tenure and Promotion Committee looks at collaboration between the former grad student and the mentor 10, 12 years later as, look, when is this person going to write on his or her own? And so that's something to be mindful of. The order, I think the order of authorship becomes less important as the group gets larger. I'll be honest with you, I've been on writing teams that have like 5, 6, 7 authors, and by the time you get to the 5th author, those people may or may not have seen the manuscript and spent much time with it. In the medical profession, there are some ginormous projects, national projects on heart disease and whatnot. And there's like 52 or 48 or 52 authors on it. I guarantee you that anyone that's like sixth author or later, that they haven't even read the paper. Now, they may have made significant contributions, and that word significant becomes the key. They may have assisted in one of the multi-site sites where they collect the data and all, and so they get their name on it. But in smaller projects, which is what education typically entails, you want to make sure that before the project starts, that there's a clear definition of what constitutes significant contribution. I have a colleague elsewhere who, not here, but elsewhere, who loves to call it the research team. Well, that may be the case, but he wants to put people on the publications who literally haven't done anything other than perhaps read a draft of the initial draft of the paper, and they weren't part of the conceptualization of the research. They weren't part of the conceptualization of a professional paper. They didn't really contribute anything other than reading a draft, and simply that's not significant. And so I'll leave it at that for now. Sorry, I hogged the microphone.
All right. Anybody else? Any thoughts on issues of authorship? And I see that Amber has dropped a couple of things in the chat as well. So thank you for that. Any other thoughts or comments about that?
Yeah, I'd like to build on what Lauren said earlier about a team and kind of taking turns. So in my experience, the author order considerations can definitely include contributions, but if it's a team and there are multiple pieces, it might also include, and this is the case for me and some of my collaborators, thinking about like the status and goals of the author team. So for example, is there someone who would benefit more or most from being first author in the first of a series of papers, for example? So I feel really fortunate that I was I was the first author on the first of a set of 3 manuscripts at a time that I was looking for a job. And it was really helpful, I think, for me. And then, you know, it just so happened that the next year, one of the collaborators was looking for a job at the same time that her first author piece came out. So I think that was, you know, kind of serendipitous that it happened that way on one hand. And on the other hand, it's something that we've kind of intentionally thought about in moving forward. And then another consideration is when there's someone on the team whose career doesn't depend on author order. And this isn't something that I would necessarily suggest, but I do know that I have a couple collaborators who were in higher education and have now moved to other spaces, and they're still co-author, but they have said, you know, I don't need this for my career. It doesn't matter for me. I won't ever be back in higher ed. I'd like to be on it, but, you know, I can be wherever makes sense. And not to say that, you know, they're doing the bulk of the work and other people are taking credit for that. But when it's a decision about like second or third author or third or fourth, I think that that's something that I do know a couple of my collaborators have generously offered to be lower down. And then another is that, as many of you know, author order differs by field. So for example, I have a collaborator who's in biology and she wants to be last, because that's, you know, that shows that, you know, or it's a signal that in her field that it comes out of her lab if she's last. So I think all of these, you know, as with many relationships and collaborations, kind of thinking like, what do you need out of this? What would be most beneficial for you? Some people that's author order, other people it's different things. So
it's very similar in the exercise science world, like in exercise physiology, for example, where the expectation is that whoever is in charge of the lab goes last. But then again, there is a little twist there, in the sense that the lab personnel may be doing a research project that the lab director knows nothing about, has not done one iota work, and yet gets his or her name on the paper, and that remains an ethical problem, and so you need to be aware of that.
Thank you. Betty, do you want to pick up some questions here? Ask some questions?
Sure. Yeah, first I just wanted to ask anyone else who's here, did you bring a question or a comment or you know, recommendations that you'd like to share with the rest of the group? Everyone here does have a lot of experience with collaboration, probably both good and maybe challenging. So we'd love to hear about either if you want to share. No? So
I'll jump in a little bit and just say, in contrast to Punya's, overestimating his contribution, I think oftentimes I'm on the flip side of it, of underestimating. And so it's a balance. And I don't know if there's, if that's pervasive, if other people have had that same, where it can be somewhat of a uncomfortable conversation. And so it's like, okay, it's just easier if I go later in the order. But it helps. And especially as Lauren mentioned, like with our collaboration, it was so comfortable. It was like a very trusting environment. And, you know, we have, in addition to being colleagues, we're friends. And so it's like easy to have that conversation, but not all collaborations are like that. Sometimes it can be quite difficult.
If I can just make a quick comment here. So Liana, you know, like Matt Kaler and I collaborated extensively in the early parts of our careers. And I think it took a little bit of time for us to build trust in each other. But once that was there, it was truly the best collaboration that it could be. We were very different in our personalities, in our way of looking and working with data and, you know, ideas. And I've always said that this was like a hot air balloon, where I was sort of the hot air because I'm like all over the place and he was the ballast. And neither of us could have flown individually, right? And so we were so much better together. But yes, initially, you know, we are both assistant professors, new, there is that sort of tentativeness. But I think that once that trust happened, it was transformative, like career-wise, but also just as a wonderful working experience. You know, we bicker like we are an old married couple. It's awesome. I love that, you know, collaboration. So thank you for sharing that.
So I was going to kind of jump in and ask in particular about working with students. And I guess my interest in that is partly because I do a lot of collaborative work with students now, particularly on like teams. And, you know, we've heard sort of both, you've got to be very clear about expectations and sort of weigh things, you know, according to contributions. And then we've heard more, well, you know, we kind of take into consideration people's career stage and all. I mean, any experiences with students with one or the other and how you found that to work? Has that, what's your recommendation or what's been your experience when you try that with students?
So I've definitely a different experience with doctoral students, both at this university and then ones that are working maybe with a collaborator at a different university. And I think that there is sometimes where a particular student can even take the lead on something. And so, for example, that collaboration I was talking about earlier around comparative genocide in shippers. At the time, I was working with 2 doctoral students who were in Mary Lou Fulton, and there was we had collected data, and there was some data that we really hadn't incorporated into what we had published so far. And I offered it to the two doctoral students who worked really well with each other as well, and said, if you wanted to, do some analysis on this with my support, and lead the writing of an article and submit it, then that would be something that the 2 of you could do. And then the 3 professors would be supportive, and the 3rd, 4th, and 5th authors. And they did. And so they reanalyzed data, and they or looked at this particular set of data on student work, and they wrote the draft and submitted it and published it. And, the 3 professors all helped on each part of it. But that was, it was sort of, let's see how they do and on this. And they were very interested and eager to do that. I've definitely worked with other doctoral students who maybe wouldn't take those steps and serve, and they had to be leaders in that. So they had to sort of email the 3 professors, 2 of whom they didn't know as well as me, and just sort of say, can you read this? We're going to submit soon, or whatever it is. I've had other doctoral students that maybe wouldn't take those steps, but I think when you see that with a doctoral student who feels like they could, who you feel that could do something like that, I think it can be worth having them have that experience with a lot of support. I will say also with authorship that it is valued, especially if you have a doctoral student who's a first author and you're the second, that's almost valued as much as you being the first. And I've heard that from the provost, and I've heard that, and certainly serving on the PEC, that is valued there as well. So I think, any support you can, if you can have that kind of situation, it's a lot more work maybe than being the first author yourself. But it can be really rewarding and really helpful for the student. And then I just want to reiterate everything that Andrea said about timing and positions people are in. And certainly throughout every collaboration, there's been discussions of, well, this would be, at this point, it would be really helpful for me to be first because I'm going up for tenure or whatever it is. And those negotiations, and generally, I don't have any horror stories. There was a question earlier about, conflicts and how do you reserve. I mean, there's been maybe little things where someone doesn't seem to be pulling their weight for a particular reason, but generally, I think I've been lucky in the people that I've worked with, and if something hasn't been the best, I don't work with that person again. And maybe it helps that my projects are smaller. So you kind of work in a project, and then if we decide to do something else, we do. But yeah, I think it really is good to sort of look out for the people you're working with and say, what does each of us need at this point, and what can we do as a team?
It does kind of go back what Lauren is noting. It goes back to the notion of choose your writing partners wisely, doesn't it? One of my colleagues is likened collaboration to teenage lovemaking, which we also call sex. And a lot more people talk about it than do it, we think. And most often it's unplanned and typically rushed. And so often it's oftentimes less satisfying. So choose your partners wisely.
Okay, if I remember anything from this conversation, it's going to be that.
I had to sneak that in, sorry.
Amber, do you want to add anything to what's been said on this topic?
I think this has all been really productive. One of the things I often learn from my collaborators too is like new approaches to engaging in these conversations, different organization structures. And so one of the things I like put in the chat earlier, but I'll bring it to the forefront, was having a conversation really early about how people work, and putting on the table, like, what is your, do you like Google Docs, Dropbox, or are you working in a Word document on your desktop? Like setting up, like, in addition to having the conversation about authorship and the contribution intellectually, conceptually, and also like in the work part, it's thinking about how the workflow maybe is a way to talk about it. And I learn every time I'm in new conversations with new team members, I learn about how to better improve my organization for myself. And so I really appreciate those conversations. And then the other thing that we give ourselves permission to do in these teams is to revisit authorship and workflow as the project gets going, because sometimes things change. We have life events. There's a particular team member that is particularly ambitious or like gets in a groove. And so we never want to stifle like forward motion. And so it's a fluid process that kind of unfolds organically, but there's definitely intention involved. And so those things have been important too. And then the other thing is I wrote Hang a private note about conflict, because I don't know, I feel still, as someone who avoids conflict at most intersections, you know, it's uncomfortable. And so I shared with her in private that I use it as an opportunity to teach me about who I want to choose to work with in the future. And so so I get through to the best of my ability that experience. And then when considering new projects, sometimes I may not choose to be a part of that team again. So those are some of the things I hold in my head while navigating those decision junctures. Another idea that kind of surfaced while we were talking about doctoral students and having them take the lead, or our role as a second author, one of the ways that I think about honoring their contribution while also building their skill is involving them in practitioner papers. And so we'll have this primary empirical article where we're sharing what we've learned, but at the same time, in a parallel lane, some of our doc students are teaming together to write the practitioner paper that operationalizes the strategy that we tested in a study with in-service, like how it works for teachers. And so there's different publication venues. There's a space in this work for all of us. And so it's really thinking about who the collaborator is and what their strengths are.
If I can just quickly, Amber, thank you for raising that point about multiple ways of thinking about publications, because there are conference presentations, authorships can be sort of very thoughtfully, intentionally designed. But I also really appreciate the piece you brought about the workflow, because it's amazing how many times you end up in the situation where you're like, file name is finally done, 3, right? And then you know there is going to be 7 more drafts of that. So just figuring like simple things like file naming conventions in this group, you know, in the team that you're working, knowing who worked on it last and which version it was, can solve so many problems, because you end up with 2 drafts which are like sort of branched out from one original, and now you have somebody's work is going to be either lost or somehow, you know, modified. I mean, we often don't sort of in our conversations pay enough attention to those logistical issues, and I think that they can really make or break the process and sort of the collaborative thing. So I really appreciate you bringing that up, which seems minor but can really get in the way of things.
And I have something to add that's related to that in terms of like workflows and keeping things moving in a way that feels good to everyone. So something that I've come to realize is that it's important to understand collaborators' relationship to their own writing. So I work with one group of collaborators that, one person just like gets it down on paper, and then we layer our writing and editing to where it gets to be very indistinguishable. Like we're not sure who, jotted down the idea first. And then, it's really like a whole bunch of integrated, all of our ideas integrated together. And we don't need to explain or rationalize any changes that we make. Like we don't even need to suggest, we can just edit. And I have another collaborator who is deeply wedded to every word and every phrase, every sentence, even like punctuation. And I inadvertently stepped on toes a couple of times early on in our collaboration, and had to like really dial things back because I made some assumptions about her relationship to her writing. And so now I know how to approach that. And not to say that I wouldn't suggest any changes, but when I do it very differently than I would with the other collaborators that we kind of layer things on. So those are kind of two extremes, but.
And I just wanted to add, I think one of the things that we do with our doctoral students in this process is we model that kind of the relationship with their work and how to work with co-authors. So, even aside from specific things about contributions, sort of the general air of building trust and collaboration and what you take to heart, I think is really an important dimension of what they learn. So but thanks for sharing that, Andrea. That's really valuable.
Clarin asked about tips and so forth. And I don't know if I have one best, but one of the things I think is really helpful. And Andrea, by the way, I don't know if I'm one of those people about writing and punctuation and so forth. I tend to be, and I think there's also different kinds of collaborations and different people in them. I tend to be more of an organizer. And then sometimes I collaborate with people who are more idea people, and that can work really well or not. And then sometimes I collaborate with people that are organizers as well, and that's always interesting. But I think one thing is about deadlines and meetings as well, and how are you going to keep the work moving? So to me, one of the best things I think to do is, if you're having a meeting, to have a to-do list come out of it, to have meeting notes in one place, to have to-do list for everyone involved come out of it, and then to set the next meeting on that meeting, and to say, we're doing this by this date, and to not maybe make those meetings too far apart, because I think sometimes things can really take a very long time if that movement's not happening or you're waiting for people to finish. So I think I've found lately that it's really about, okay, are we going to take 2 weeks to do this? Everyone does this in 2 weeks. Let's set the meeting right now. And then, sometimes things happen and so forth, but that has helped in a lot of ways.
And I think these are all good examples of sometimes collaborations just don't get off the ground, like for whatever reason, but it can be a variety of things. And it's not necessarily the fault, or the intentions are good, but just it can be a total mix of just different styles, and that's okay. And to be like, this looks great on paper. It's kind of maybe a dating metaphor, like Hans mentioned, like this looks great on paper, but for whatever reason, it doesn't necessarily function. And, and you gave it a go, and that's fine. And then everyone kind of just moves on, and that's okay.
One suggestion I would make is that, or one tip is that it's important that your collaborator is willing to take feedback. We all think we're great writers, which I know that's not true. I have a colleague that I've written with on several occasions, and every time he brings back a draft and it's littered with being more succinct, eliminating unnecessary words. He's trying to be more parsimonious, and so getting a thick skin will allow both collaborators on a dual writing project having a thick skin, and understanding that the goal is to improve the quality of the paper and the quality of the writing is that should be the central goal. And so one if I can hog a little more microphone is that if you're working with somebody and he or she provides you with a chapter or a draft of a paper, when you provide feedback, make sure it's specific, both in terms of what's really well written, not just oh good job or well written, but I highlight what is good about the paragraph. Does the paragraph set the next paragraph up, and is there flow? And as was mentioned earlier as well. And then also suggestions for edits. And within that, if you're going to give some feedback about, well, this sentence or this paragraph is not clear, it's good to make a note of that, but it would be much more constructive and much more helpful for your collaborator to provide him or her with an alternative way of phrasing it. And so, yeah, be more specific, be as specific as possible in your feedback. English is my second language, and but I cringe at some of the grammar that's being used in both in academic writing and the media as well. This notion of the data suggest, or I mean, data are inanimate objects, and I cringe when people keep using that notion. I mean, the researchers are suggesting, not the data. So I cringe.
That's a great point, Hans. So I think, yeah, many of us take our writing very personally, and it can be very upsetting when someone changes what you've written, particularly with no explanation. It just makes me think that's another thing to get to know about your collaborators, right? Is just how personally they take
it's not intended to be personal. The goal is to write the best possible piece of writing. And so anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Well, and I think we're just about at the end of our just an hour, unfortunately. So thanks so much, everyone, for all the suggestions and tips as usual. Oh, Amber, we need a whole nother session about the participants. Absolutely. We didn't talk about that at all. So we'll put that on the list for future conversations. But yeah, so just a reminder, we'll put the recording up on the site, the college website by sometime next week, usually early next week. A couple of just additional announcements and reminders for what's coming next. Mark McCain reminded me that just to mention again the fact that the Mary Lou Fulton sort of principled innovation has become one of the design principles of the university. And in fact, the university management team, which is the very broad group of leaders across campus, will be coming to the West Campus on March 29th to actually celebrate principled innovation as a new design aspiration. So that's something that I think we should all feel proud of in the college. And just a few announcements about Just an Hour coming up. Because of the TCDC conference next week, we will not be holding a Just an Hour session, nor will we the following Friday, which is the Friday before spring break. In fact, to remind you again, we encourage you to participate in the Current Issues in Education Journal celebration that morning. And the following week after that, March 10th, is spring break. So no Just an Hour then. We'll come back to Just an Hour on March 17th, which is St. Patrick's Day, for a discussion of AI in education. And I don't think we have our complete list of participants ready yet, but that's sure to be, I think, a really engaging conversation. I'm sure you've all seen a lot of the discussions in the media about ChatGPT, among other tools, and its implications for education at all levels. So
I don't know, Betty, if people have followed the news just that came out yesterday about Bing's chat with this alter ego called Sydney. I mean, it is insane the way it was seeking to manipulate, use people's psychology against yourself. So we are entering into very interesting territory in the sense of the old Chinese saying, you know, may you live in interesting times. And I think it goes way beyond sort of, students writing papers. It has to do with broader social things around misinformation and so on. So I'm really looking forward to that conversation, because I think it's a critical one for us to be having, not just in terms of like students will plagiarize papers. I think it goes deeper than that, and has huge implications for education and learning.